So, let's talk about one of the great paradoxes of American history. You've got a nation founded by deeply religious people, who then turned around and built a government that is explicitly secular. How on earth did that happen? And, what does that really mean for us today?
Right. This is the central question. And this wasn't some historical accident, It was a very deliberate design choice, and it had massive implications. And believe me, the framers had a crystal clear answer, one that was forged in the fire of history, philosophy, and their own very unique take on faith.
So let's dive right in with Section 1, the founding paradox. To really get a handle on the wall between church and state, you've got to understand that this wasn't a rejection of the founders' faith. No, it was a direct result of it.
And that's the whole thing. The source material makes it crystal clear. This was a logical conclusion, not some kind of contradiction. The framers had a front row seat to centuries of history where state-sponsored religion didn't lead to peace. It led to persecution and bloodshed. Their conclusion? The only way to protect both real, genuine faith and a stable government was to build a solid barrier between them.
So what on earth drove them to that pretty radical conclusion? Well, that brings us to Section 2, Lessons from a Bloody Past. You have to remember, the framers were huge students of history, and the history they were looking at was just one of relentless violence, all fueled by mixing church and state. I mean, just think about it. For nearly 200 years after the Reformation, Europe basically tore itself apart. The 30 Years' War alone wiped out an estimated 20% of the population of the Holy Roman Empire. That's 1 in 5 people. Gone. And these weren't just political squabbles. These were state-backed wars over who had the one true religion.
And this led the framers to a really radical insight. The source points out that they realized the problem wasn't one specific religion, Catholic versus Protestant. The fundamental flaw was the toxic alliance of any religion with the power of government. That structure, they saw, inevitably turns political disagreement into heresy and theological debates into bloody civil wars.
Now you might think, okay, but things were different in the New World, right? But here's the crazy irony. They weren't. So many of the colonies were founded by people looking for religious freedom for themselves, but they were incredibly quick to turn around and deny that same freedom to others.
And this wasn't some distant problem for the framers. No, they saw it with their own eyes. In Massachusetts, you had a Puritan theocracy that brutally punished anyone who disagreed. Down in Virginia, the law said you had to go to the Anglican Church and you had to pay for it with your taxes. This really hit home for young James Madison, who was just personally outraged when he saw Baptist preachers being thrown in jail for the crime of preaching without a license from the state.
Okay, so armed with all these harsh lessons from Europe and their own backyard, the framers turned to Enlightenment philosophy to come up with a radical new solution, a truly secular republic.
A lot of the intellectual heavy lifting here came from the philosopher John Locke. He basically argued for a clear division of labor. Think of it like 2 different jurisdictions, right? Government's job is to protect our civil interests, our life, our liberty, our property, and its tool is outward force. Religion, on the other hand, its job is the care of souls, and its only tool is inward persuasion. You just can't force someone into genuine belief. It doesn't work.
And this is a really important point about the framers' own beliefs. Most of them weren't atheists, but they weren't Orthodox Christians either. They were what you might call theistic rationalists. They believed that reason was the ultimate guide. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, literally took a razor to the Bible and cut out all the miracles just to keep Jesus' moral teachings. Their powerful belief in individual reason and conscience is what led them directly to support a secular state for everyone.
So this wall of separation, it wasn't a one-way street. It really had 2 crucial jobs. First, it protected the state from religion to stop those torrents of blood they'd seen in Europe. But just as important, it protected religion from the state. James Madison argued that when government gets involved with religion, it just makes faith weak, corrupt, and arrogant, leading to, in his words, pride and indolence in the clergy.
And this wasn't just talk either. They actually put their money where their mouth was and wrote this principle into law, step by step. The big fight started in Virginia, where Madison successfully defeated a religious tax. That victory paved the way for Jefferson's Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which then became the model for the First Amendment. And then, a few years later, Jefferson gave us that unforgettable metaphor, a wall of separation between church and state.
Okay, so this brings us right up to today, and to a modern challenge to this whole idea. And I want to be super clear here. Everything we're about to discuss, the definitions, the analysis, it's all coming directly from the source material for this explainer.
So, what is Christian nationalism? Well, according to the source, it's really important to understand that it's not a religion itself. Instead, the source defines it as a political ideology. Its main goal is to blur the lines and ultimately fuse Christian identity with American identity. The core idea is that the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation and that our laws should reflect that belief.
And when you put the two worldviews side by side, like this chart from the source does, the contrast is, well, it's pretty stark. Let's just take the role of government. The framers saw it as a neutral referee, there to protect the civil interests of everyone, no matter their faith. But in the Christian nationalist view, the government's role is to actually enforce a specific set of Christian values. As you can see, the source documents this kind of fundamental opposition on every single point. Now, the source also points to some pretty interesting data that suggests this ideology might be having an impact on the judiciary. An analysis that's cited in the material found that while past Supreme Courts ruled in favor of Christian groups less than half the time, that number jumped to 58% under the Rehnquist Court, and under the current Roberts Court, it's up to 66%.
And the argument from the source is that this isn't just about the numbers. It's about specific, real-world court decisions that seem to be chipping away at that wall of separation. Things like allowing public money to go to private religious schools, upholding prayer by public school employees, and of course, the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, which was a huge victory celebrated by many Christian nationalist groups.
So, the big question is, if the framers were here today, faced with this challenge, what would they say? What would they advise? Well, the source suggests that their own writings actually give us a pretty clear roadmap for how they'd tell us to respond.
It really boils down to a three-part plan. First up, civic education. Go back and read the original documents to really understand why they built that wall in the first place. Second, institutional defense. Be vigilant and actively oppose any attempts to break down that wall in the courts or in Congress. And third, citizen action. Mobilize, speak out, because a threat to anyone's freedom of conscience is a threat to everyone's.
And that quote from Madison, man, it's just so powerful and urgent. He's not saying wait until things get really bad. He's saying sound the alarm at the very first experiment on our liberties. It's a call to be constantly on guard.
And that brings us to the real takeaway here. Following the framers' logic, defending a secular government isn't about being anti-religion, not at all. It's actually a shared duty for everyone, religious, non-religious, you name it, who values the freedom of conscience, the freedom of the human mind.
So we're left with this final, powerful thought. The entire American experiment wasn't built on a shared belief system. It was built on a shared commitment to everyone's freedom to choose their own. And the question the framers are basically asking us across the centuries is, what are we willing to do to keep it that way?